Today is the first day Yuli came as a son-in-law. He and her husband moved to the village of the in-laws for some time. But unfortunately, in this countryside, not all houses have a private bathroom, including Yuli's husband's house, so that inevitably Yuli had to go to Sendang village, or a public bath, which is quite far from his home, even to go to the Sendang of this village. Then he must pass through several lush gardens. Rural is indeed very remote. Even the distance between neighboring houses was quite far away. Likewise, lighting still uses outboard lights, while the husband trying to persuade Yuli to be patient for a while so that you can stay at home, after arranging some moving items. Finally, the day was late in the afternoon. Yuli intended to go to the general bath. The water is clean and clear, flowing without stopping. Making Yuli began to like the atmosphere of the village and also the spring. But to go to Sendang, Yuli was not allowed to go alone. But Yuli knows in-laws, brother-in-law, and also her husband are busy with their respective activities. But sometimes, several times, Yuli was determined. Going to Sendang village alone, without anyone accompanied, according to the story. There was once a trader who stopped by and spent the night in this area. And when the night began to arrive, the migrants went on a leadership to clean themselves. And after that, the migrants immediately possessed. Morning arrived. Yuli intends to take a shower in the village spring. Yuli went on a leadership alone because he thought during the day it would be safe for him. The bathing place was quiet and quiet. Only Yuli alone enjoyed the clear bath water. Suddenly, the voice of the person who was walking toward him. Yuli turned his head, and there was nothing. Even the sky that was bright clean suddenly turned into a dark cloudy. That made Yuli speed up her bath and quickly go home. Finally, Yuli told this to her brother-in-law and her in-laws. They said that was normal, especially when he was alone in the baths. Even Yuli's in-laws told that in the past there was a woman who was bathing in the bath. After he got up to leave, suddenly his consciousness began to blur, fainting, and accidentally slipped his feet until his head entered the pool. The woman's life was beyond help. After that incident, the baths were changed into public baths so that many people could be used. Today, Yuli's husband said goodbye, going to the city for a few days. And Yuli began to get used to going alone. He also entered the Sendang pool to take a shower, but suddenly from behind, as if someone was watching him, a few moments later, Yuli raised her laundry and was about to go home. A few moments he walked, suddenly her husband appeared from behind. Yulipun feels happy that her husband has returned, as well as helping her to bring the laundry. For a moment, until the front of the house, the husband permission to leave again with the excuse of going to the fields. But until the night before, the husband never returned. Julipun waited for him in front of the house. A few moments later, someone called him from the dark. Juli smiled broadly because it was the husband who finally returned. The husband invited Juli to get out. They walked to enjoy the rural atmosphere of the night. After a few moments later, the husband drove Juli to the house, and he also said goodbye to the field again at midnight. The next day, the afternoon before, Juli went to Sendang Desa to take a shower. For a moment, he soaked himself in the spring pool. Suddenly, the husband appeared behind him. Julipun smiled happily. Her husband had returned. Shortly after bathing and going back, the husband invited Juli to go to the field with him. They passed through thick bamboo trees. And there is a simple hut in it. The husband invited Juli in, and they also spent the night as a married couple in the hut. In the morning arrived. Juli woke up alone in the hut. A moment later, the husband came with grilled cassava for Juli. And they also took a shower together in the village. For a moment, Juli invited her husband to go home to her in-laws, but the husband did not want to. The husband reasoned he was guarding the fields. Even the husband invited Juli to just be buried, because the distance was closer to the village spring. Without the slightest suspicion, Juli also agreed to the invitation of her husband to live in the middle of the bamboo garden. A few days passed. Juli and her husband lived happily like a husband and wife. Until finally, suddenly vaguely heard a voice that called Juli's name. The longer the flare is harder. The husband of husband, brother, in-law and in-laws of Juli, who was noisy calling his name. Juli jerked, but the husband was in front of him. Juli was even more confused by the voice that was calling his name. The suar was getting louder and louder to make Juli's ears hurt, and suddenly the husband in front of him suddenly turned into a scary creature. Instantly, Julipun's view was dark, and he was unconscious. The residents, the in-laws, brother-in-law, and husband Juli were carrying a torch. They were shocked seeing Juli was in a bamboo tree with a state of unconsciousness. A few days passed. Juli, who is still in a daze, still can't be spoken to. The husband, brother, in-law, and the in-laws were even more worried about Juli's condition, which apparently, according to them, Juli had disappeared for 2 weeks. Rian and Nino say goodbye to Iam's mother for their long journey. Nino kissed his mother's hand and hugged her. As if the two of them would be apart for a long time, they started to walk away from Iam's mother's hut. Mrs. Item's gentle wave accompanied Rian and Nino's steps. On their journey, Rian and Nino continued to pray so that their minds would not go blank. Rian and Nino believe that they are young men who disappeared in the village because they were kidnapped by the Lampas grandmother for ritual needs. Lampas grandmother herself is a term for followers of black magic who often sacrifice humans to increase their knowledge. Even though their determination is strong, they are still wary, afraid that this trip would fail, with the risk of never returning. The journey of these two young men, only provided with 2 packs of rice with boiled cassava leaves as a side dish and 1 piece of bamboo made like a bottle filled with water. Nino explained that if there is something on the way like strange things, it's just a trick of supernatural beings. And not long after what Nino said, Rian saw a village that was very ancient and looked very shabby. Nino ordered, "Whatever happens, Rian can't be far from her. Stay focused. Don't look left or right." Until finally Rian and Nino entered the ancient village. As could be expected, all the residents of the ancient village looked at Rian and Nino sarcastically. Their faces were pale with blank looks and were frozen at the same time. The two of them arrived at the end of the village. Finally, Rian and Nino entered the forbidden forest, and finally they arrived at the gate. Nino stopped walking, followed by Rian. Nino gave him a package, which was the wooden branch that Iam's mother had told him would save the village youth. Nino ordered when Rian entered the magical village, "So run as quickly as possible, because the supernatural beings inside will fight to get the package containing the twigs. Meanwhile, Nino will run behind Rian to guard him." Beyond reason, it was not 1 or 2 creatures that they saw, but the whole village started running after the package that Rian was carrying. Suddenly, Rian fell to the ground very hard. If his body hit a rock and Rian was unconscious. Soon after that, Nino's voice was heard, awakening Rian from his stupor with several splashes of water on his face. Nino smiled. Rian checked the package containing the twigs, which was still firmly in his arms. Because they were tired, Rian and Nino ate their lunch, packed rice and boiled cassava leaves. Faintly heard the sound of people running. Rian and Nino are shocked. It turns out the village youths are missing. They managed to escape from Grandma Lampas's ritual, but they just circled around in the forest without knowing a way out. Without thinking, Nino immediately invited the youth and Rian to go to the gate they had passed earlier. They ran endlessly, enduring fear and pain and hunger. Sometime later, they arrived at the gate of the magical village. Nino told Rian to stick in the branch he was carrying, right in the middle of the gate. The small twig slowly grew and grew into a very large tree that was getting bigger and bigger. Nino ordered the village youths to pass through the gate before it was blocked by a large tree. They ran without stopping, without looking back. They ran and kept running until everything became dark. Rian and the village youths began to wake up one by one. A crowd of villagers gathered to greet them carrying torches. Rian looked around. Nino wasn't there. It turns out that Nino deliberately sacrificed himself to save the village youths and Rian from being returned to the real world by the old grandmother. The police are examining a young woman, beautiful and sexy. With a minimal clothing, the girl became accused for the case of middle-aged men's death in a hotel room 3 hours ago. Witnesses from the hotel said. The young woman, running, rushed out of the room after the victim was found lifeless. The young woman intended asking help from the hotel to examine the middle-aged young man. So quickly, the hotel officers came to check into the room, and the victim was found dead on his back on the bed. In the corpse room, a middle-aged woman sobbing. He lamented the departure of her husband, who was now lying rigid before her. His tears sounded very sad, so making hospital employees become sorry to see him. A few moments later, Indy entered into the corpse room. Indy ran into the middle-aged woman. Indy smiled faintly. Behind the middle-aged young woman, clearly the figure of the husband's spirit, who was walking, floating behind him. Indy too opened the curtain. The body of the middle-aged man right in front of his eyes. Strong suspicion, his death because of being poisoned by someone, and somehow the poison could be swallowed by the victim. And the death incident coincided when the middle-aged man was together with the young woman he brought to the hotel. The police interrogated the young woman, but the woman did not know anything about the poison that was swallowed by her partner. The young woman with the pit, she and the Parubaya man have finished go to the same safety, but there has never been any incident. But unfortunate that day, suddenly the Parubaya man suddenly seizures after taking strong medicine, which according to the testimony of the young woman, the strong medicine was used to drink when they were together, and the dose was not excessive. Indy immediately entered another dimension. Suddenly the wife appeared from the victim. The wife went berserk at the police station while swearing to wear the young woman's mixture for her husband's death. Unfortunately, the police immediately secured the two, while confusion, who should be protected. Indy also stared at the body that was increasingly blue and stiff. In an instant, even though he entered another dimension, the place of death, the middle-aged man took place. The atmosphere of the hotel in general, some people passing by with their suitcases, from the hotel lobby. Seen middle-aged men check in with a young woman who looks beautiful and sexy. They both looked happy and very intimate, carrying luxury groceries which had just been bought. While laughing in each other, the two of them walked to the hotel room they had rented. A moment later, middle-aged men and young women had taken off their clothes. And without thinking, the middle-aged man sucked down the powder that he deliberately brought from home. But not long ago, after drinking the strong medicine, the seizure man, with his mouth foaming, and finally not an old man, was unconscious. Whereas young women who panicked quickly ran for the help of the hotel. Hotel employees immediately rushed to their room. The middle-aged man lying on his bed with a foamy mouth. The spirit of the Bayou Men's men pointed to a package of strong medicine that claimed his life. The powder is scattered on the bed. Indy, too, is in another dimension. At night, at the residence of a middle-aged man, the husband said gently to his wife that he would go out of town for business matters for several days. Then the middle-aged man, and even then lay down and fell asleep on his bed. The wife, staring at him cynically, and as if full of anger that was held. He turned to the husband's cell phone lying on the table. The husband's cell phone is always in the password. But coincidentally, the wife knows all the passwords owned by the husband. With a flat face, as if he already knew what he would find in her husband's cell phone. Hundreds of intimate chat results from the affair of her husband with young girls who deliberately offer themselves for money. There are countless young girls that he has made the affair of their marriage. And the reason is always the same, namely, going out of town for business matters. And finally, communication is troubled with reasons to be busy. The anger that had been up and down that night was no longer able to end. The wife replaces the strong medicine that is usually taken by her husband with cyanide poison, which he has prepared in advance, with the poison he placed where the strong medicine was usually put by her husband. Indy returned to real dimensions. Indy looked with a flat look at the spirit of the middle-aged man. As an indigo who knows the real incident, Indy does not want to help the spirit of middle-aged men who clearly betray his wife. But when Indy must be confronted as a professional, a forensic doctor, evidence and reality must still be written significantly as a report. A few days later, the police also caught his wife, who was proven strong as the owner of cyanide, who had claimed the life of her husband. Traces of proof of online purchase detected by the police. And finally, the wife also admitted that he was the one who deliberately wanted to poison her husband because he was annoyed and angry at the affair committed by her husband so far, while the young woman was released from the accusation of murder. As usual, when it rained heavily, Adi and his younger brother Don asked their mother for permission to play in the rainwater in front of the house. After the mother permits, not long after, their friend named Tito arrived. They also took a rain shower together. The mother, who had been monitoring them from inside the house, finally fell asleep. While his mother was asleep, Tito invites Adi and Fajar to play in the rain some distance from their house. They had so much fun playing. The three of them arrived at a place where many other small children had gathered to take a rain shower, namely in a football field area, which has knee-high puddles. They swam here and there happily, unexpectedly. They arrived somewhere, namely former excavations that are more than 1 meter deep. Continue running until finally the three of them approached the location. Without thinking, Adi and Tito jumped into the flooded excavation. As a result, the three children who could not swim drowned. They tried to wave their hands to be seen by their friends playing above, to come help them. Unfortunately, there was only a 3-year-old Don. Seeing his brother waving, Don slowly approached and plunged into the puddle of excavated soil. Adi, Tito, and Fajar continued to try to find out how they can survive. Adi continued to move his body, but the water had entered his throat. Meanwhile, little Don slowly began to sink his body lower and lower. Adi tried his best to hold his younger brother's arm, but Adi himself felt increasingly weak. Adi and Tito are increasingly panicking. Excruciating pain began to creep in. My mouth was tight, my head hurt, my ears were ringing violently, and finally, slowly, they didn't feel their bodies gradually sinking down, almost touching the ground. However, Tanganadi was still trying to feel the edge of the earthen wall. When he touched, it felt like Adi was holding something like a small but strong twig. Adi holds her tightly, and strangely, suddenly the object slowly pulled him to the surface, when the head and half of the body come out of the water. Adi struggled to get out of the well. Likewise with Tito, who has also managed to rise to the top. Their breathing was heavy and they lay on the ground, and their vision suddenly became completely dark. Then a very bright light appeared. Fajar, his little brother, waved at Adi, then disappeared with the light. You can see the shadow again, where Tito and Adi drowned in a puddle. The two children looked like they were starting to faint. Even their hand movements have started to become inactive. Fajar's little brother ran around the well, tried to help his brother, but his hand wouldn't reach. Fajar ran here and there looking for wood, but he couldn't find it. Finally, Don found a small twig. Fajar used the small twig to reach his brother's hand. Adi's hand immediately grabbed the small branch. while continuing to try to raise his body to the surface. It turns out that the one who helped Adi was his little brother, namely the spirit of dawn who has sunk to the bottom. Can't hold back the regret. Adi cried uncontrollably when he woke up from his dream in his mother's arms. and anglers are cool preparing the fishing hook. The fishing rod was thrown into the river. And he sat quietly waiting for the fishing hook. Hope there are fish that will soon eat bait. In his silence, suddenly passed by. From the river flow, a corpse without identity crossed right in front of him. Suddenly the anglers shouted in fear and ran away. Not long after, the river was full of police and police limiting lines. Indy, an apprentice student. He is a prospective forensic doctor. Indy walked into the corpse room. For a moment, Indo stared wistfully at the corpse of a middle-aged man who was washed away in the river. Indy jerked into another dimension. Seen an employee named Ronnie. He looked very annoyed at the boss because the submission of his death was rejected raw. Ronnie works at the boss's refill water stall. He has worked for about 5 months. Initially, his work was good in accordance with the direction of the boss. But over time, Ronnie began to dare to borrow money from the boss continuously, without knowing when the debt he would be able to pay. Ronnie always reasoned that the debt he wanted to borrow will be used for daily needs. On the night there was a terrible event. There was a quarrel between the boss and Ronnie. The boss allegedly no longer wanted to give Ronnie because of the previous debt. There was nothing he paid. Upset not given any more anniversary, Ronnie-pun climbed furiously. Hardly Ronnie, hitting the iron bars beside him, immediately the head of his boss, until the boss immediately fell down unconscious. Ronnie's action was not enough. After hitting the boss's head using iron, Ronnie immediately took money from the shop drawer. Then Ronnie also wrapped his boss's body with a cardboard box. Then put it in a sack. Then Ronnie carried his boss's body past the back door. By using the motorbike he used to deliver gallons. Ronnie put his boss's body on the motorbike pillion. He also emphasized his motorbike to a bridge. Seeing the river water flow that night was very heavy. So, a good idea for Ronnie to immediately throw the boss's body into the river. That way he hopes there is no evidence that can be found. Then Ronnie returned to the kiosk. And cleaned the remaining blood spill. Ronnie immediately changed his clothes that were hit by blood spots, and then burned it behind the stall. Suddenly a pale hand stomping his shoulder Indy. The spirit of middle-aged man in front of him is now behind him. The soul of the man continued to follow Indy wherever Indy went. Until finally Indy was upset and was forced to help the spirit of the Parubaya man. Indy immediately came to the shop shown by the Parubaya spirit. Of course, the store is closed and there are no signs of residents. Then a woman, one of the employees at the store as well, came to Indy. The woman said that her boss was going out of town. The boss's spirit pointed to a corner of the room. There is a CCTV camera that is deliberately made not visible to monitor store activities. Then Indy saw the surroundings, and there was really CCTV, as shown by the Parubaya male spirit. India came to the police station and handed over CCTV footage. It was clear that the murder was carried out by Ronnie. Employees themselves. The village was finally tantrum. It turned out that the refill water boss, instead of going out of town, but has died and his body was found in the river. A few days later, Ronnie was immediately arrested by the police without being able to fight. While the refill water stalls, now it's really sealed. Upon Ronnie's capture, the boss's spirit can now go calmly. While Indy stood tall facing the river while sighing and enjoying the cool air. From earlier, Marnie only pacing back and forth in the room while stroking her waist, which was very painful. The longer the pain became more and more, sweat on his face dripped and flooded. While there was a raindrop on the roof accompanied by strong winds, a sign of heavy rain, Marnie tried to call her husband, but the number was inactive. The husband works at night shifts, while his parents and parents-in-law lived away from where they live. Likewise, the homes of the neighbors. Even so, Marnie realized that her husband chose overtime to work as a construction worker in the villagers, to collect labor costs later. Marnie looked at the clock. Refined once again, her husband's number was still inactive. The day was getting darker, really midnight. Suddenly it felt like something broke. On the sidelines of his thighs. It was certain that the sound of amniotic fluid was broken. And that means Marnie's child must be born immediately. Marnie immediately walked slowly out of the house, although street lighting is still improvised. It is still forced to walk alone. He tried to go to the Puskesmas, in the middle of the night alone on foot. which of course, the distance is not close to his house. Around very quiet, dark streets. The neighbor's house was quite far, making it difficult for Marnie to ask for help. It felt like the amniotic water flowing was getting heavier between her thighs. The sound of night animals shouted with each other. Marnie continued to walk with exhaustion, accompanied by drizzling rain and lightning sound. Despite the pain, still stepped on his feet while stroking his big stomach. From a distance, the sound of dogs shouted with each other from various directions. Suddenly, behind him, the sound of the vehicle's brakes stopped. Marnie turned back. A middle-aged father stopped the pace of his pedicab while staring at Marnie. Without thinking, snood into the rickshaw, praying. Hopefully the father is a good person, because Marnie is also no longer able to walk. The rickshaw's heroes also shot quickly, dividing the very dark streets. Marnie, who felt pain, did not realize that they had reached the hospital. He read slowly. The board displayed in front of the hospital. Kasih Ibu Hospital. Marnie went down slowly down the pedicab. No longer cared about the irregularities he felt. The most important thing is that now his child can be born safely. And even Marnie had not yet said thank you. The pedicab driver has disappeared. Then someone patted his shoulder. He immediately turned around and saw a man wearing a white coat holding a wheelchair with a smile. While pushed in a wheelchair, Marnie passed the hospital hallway. Many mothers wear kebaya. Hair was bun. They stopped their activities and focused on staring at Marnie with a cold look. Marnie was immediately pushed into the delivery room. A nurse was seen with her hair, wearing a kebaya shirt, welcomed Marnie. Marnie Pun smiled at her baby. He took a long breath. Marnie was really sad. Imagine her husband who had returned. It must be very worrying about him because it disappears suddenly. The sound of the tears of his little baby echoed in the room. Suddenly drowsiness suddenly attacked Marnie. Faintly heard the sound of someone shouted with each other. The aroma of the carcass and cantil flour burst. Immediately opened his eyes slowly. Glare lights make the eyes difficult to open. Judging by around, a room with all white nuances, while Marnie herself is still lying on the bed where maternity. In an instant, the baby was in the doctor's arms, smiling at Marnie. Suddenly the doctor walked, carrying a baby Marnie. Marnie immediately got out of bed even though he still felt pain, still forced walking, following the doctor from behind, who was carrying his son out of the room. Marnie was even more worried because the doctor ignored him when he was called. Marnie was even more surprised, not when he saw the atmosphere outside was still dark, covered in dark clouds, and there was only a moonlight that helped illuminate his gaze. Marnie is getting confused. The doctor's shadow is invisible anymore, and now Marnie is in the hallway of the hospital alone. Appear at the very end of the door opening and closing by itself. Marnie saw a woman standing wearing a white shirt with a broken face and covered in blood, staring sharply at her, walking slowly and getting closer. For a moment, Marnie was about to shout. Suddenly, the doctor's voice was surprised. The hand was opened that covered his face slowly. The doctor was carrying Marnie's daughter. For a moment, Marnie was about to take the baby. However, his gaze suddenly blurred. The voice of grandfather woke up Marnie from his stupors. The spark of water wet his face. Slowly opened his eyes, slowly, even though it felt very heavy. Suddenly, the sound of the baby's cry was loud. Marnie turned and grabbed her baby. There was a white-haired old grandfather staring at Marnie. While closing her baby, slowly, Marnie saw all directions. Marnie was really shocked to death. Apparently, a lot of mounds of ground and gravestones lined up in front of him. Marnie was silent for a moment because she felt shocked, until the baby's cry made him realize again. Quickly, Marnipun hugged her baby. The old grandfather, the grave digger at the cemetery, quickly helped Marnie to stand and quickly moved from the grave area. Although difficult to think about with reason, Marnie has experienced magical labor. He gave birth to the burial, and luckily, the baby was born safely, even with the umbilical cord that had dried without wounds. At night, Pras was walking to the house after working all day. When the trip home, his steps were blocked by a group of bad people carrying sharp weapons. Suddenly, everything became pitch black. A few moments later, Pras opened his eyes and there was no one on the road. So did Jeron Moban, carrying a sharp weapon earlier. So Pras continues the journey to the house. Arriving at home, Pras lay down on the bed to let go of his fatigue. The next day, Pras won breakfast with the same menu as yesterday he ate. Light a television, which broadcast the news that there was a hijacking on the road that was passed by last night. Without thinking, Pras saw his cell phone that had no signal. For a moment he was about to call Wati, his girlfriend. Suddenly the cell phone died from running out of battery, with a faint sound of many people outside the house. Pras peeked briefly, but not too interested in finding out. Pras entered his parents' room. Seen the mother was fast asleep with the same clothes worn yesterday, while the father played with his pet chicken like yesterday too. Then Pras remembered that today Wati, her lover, was having a job interview call, but unfortunately his cell phone is dead. Pras rushed to Wati's house. In the middle of the trip, the sky was seen cloudy, and many people whose gaze empty ran into Pras. Do not want to be so bothering with the state of the person. Pras continued to walk towards Wati's house. A few moments later, he arrived. The door was knocked, but it seemed like there was no one. Then someone's voice was heard in the house. Pras peeked from the glass window. Wati's aunt was calling someone, but Wati was not visible to her nose. In his conversation on the phone, Aunt said that Wati and her mother's father were going to her house. Hearing that, Pras felt a little surprised and funny. When he went to Wati's house, Wati even went to Pras's house. Today is Sunday, Pras prejudice. Wati and her parents intend to friendship to her family Pras, just as Pras used to do with his family, who likes to meet with Wati's house. So Pras decided to return to his house again on foot. Not long, Pras has arrived in front of the alley of his house, visible white flag, a sign of a family that is grieving. Pras asked himself, who died today, because he did not hear the announcement of the deaths of residents from the mosque toa. Pras stepped into the house. The crowd is more and more, and the crowd was at Pras's house. There is a coffin. Pras saw Wati and her parents wearing a black shirt while holding back tears. Pras was even more curious. Who died actually? Pras is getting closer, seen his father and mother crying, sobbing very sadly. Pras looked at the coffin. It turned out that the body in the coffin was himself. Then the ambulance siren came. Pras's body was transported into an ambulance to the burial place, a few hours before the funeral. Tonight, the last night of the night market. The atmosphere was so crowded. Pras and Wati enjoy various rides in that place, traveling around enjoying their date, as well as enjoying the beauty of fireworks together. After late, Pras drove Wati home. Even after saying goodbye. Pras just remembered that he has prepared a ring to propose to his lover. At night, Pras was walking to the house after working all day. When the trip home, his steps were blocked by a group of bad people carrying sharp weapons. A group of thugs came carrying sharp stuff. Horde tried to gang up on the bag brought by Pras. It happened. One of them slit his neck with the knife they carried.
Ranti, ayo bangun, nak.
That morning, Rio's school had a new student. A beautiful girl moving from out of town. In front of the class, the new student introduced himself named Ranti. Ranti has straight black hair, as well as her beautiful and sweet face. After introducing himself, Ranti sat on a bench that had been prepared. She sat next to Mila, one of the smart students in class. During recess, all students went out of the classroom. But it was seen that Ranti just sat alone in his seat. With no further ado, Rio introduced himself while reaching out to shake hands. Ranti also threw her sweet smile. Rio sat next to Ranti for small talk. Suddenly, the troublemaker school gang entered their class. They have 3 people pulling Rio's clothes and want to ask for money. They threatened to beat Rio if he did not give money. Suddenly, one of them doing insolent to Ranti by holding her chest. Ranti was so surprised, then he stood up from his seat while staring at the face of the gang full of emotion. His friends also rebuked the insolent child. Branches break the table, and suddenly a hard blow landed on his student's face. Children who gripped Rio immediately let go of the collar of his shirt. The devastated student fainted on the floor with his mouth bleeding. The blood flowed slowly from his mouth. Ranti's reaction also slowly looked strange. His eyes continued to be fixed towards the blood. Slowly he also smiled when he saw blood flowing. Suddenly Ranti was like a person who was possessed, beat the fainting child, until the blood continues to come out of his mouth. His friend tried to prevent Ranti, but they immediately fell on the floor. Likewise with Rio, he tried to hold Ranti, who was raging. However, Rio's energy could not hold him, and even more terrible, Ranti licked the blood splattered on the floor, while giggling. The puffing children ran away in fear. Ranti, who initially beautiful girl, now looks terrible, with her mouth covered in blood. Not long after, some teachers came to class. They were surprised to see the male student lying on the floor, in a state of fainting and covered in blood. The naughty gang members complained to the teachers. Seeing that, Rio tried to put up a body for Ranti. Rio admitted that he was the one who beat the insolent student. And finally, Rio was brought by the teacher council to the office, while Ranti still looks enthusiastic, while staring at fresh blood splattered on the floor. Ranti's gaze was really terrible, until no one dared to approach Ranti. Ranti giggled with fresh blood that still wet her mouth. "14 years ago, a wealthy family that lives in the countryside. The wealth of the family is countless. They have a vast rice field and garden. But one that they do not have, namely a child. Many suggest to take adoption children, but they don't want to. They want a baby born from their own womb. All medical things to get offspring have been done, but the results remain nil. The wealthy couple, he was both infertile. Until finally they came to a powerful shaman to get a child. They want children born from themselves. The shaman also agreed with their request. At night, the full moon, a married couple did a ritual with the shaman. namely the ritual of stealing the womb from someone, to be moved to his wife. After a while, finally the wife's stomach was enlarged, as if there was a baby in the womb. The couple was very happy waiting for the birth of the baby. And even then the baby was born a woman and was named Ranti. And one thing that was not told by the shaman to the married couple, which is from where the content they receive. The figure of a creepy female creature often came to the shaman asking for his child to be returned. The shaman could not return the child from the creepy creature because the child had been born as a human child, Ranti. Until finally the creepy creature often possessed Ranti's body, until Ranti has the same behavior as the mother, which likes the smell of rancid blood and then drink it. A farmer named Rosti, arrested by the police for killing a resident named Ramli. Rosti felt annoyed because Ramli often teases him about being disabled. Since the accident that Rosti experienced several years ago, Rosti's hands and feet became disabled until you can't walk normally as usual. Finally, Rosti opened a coffee shop for his livelihood. Meanwhile, Ramli himself is Rosti's neighbor who likes to buy coffee at Rosti's shop because they feel familiar with each other. Ramli seems to always make fun of the disabled Rosti without hesitation. For an early start, Rosti just smiled. But Ramli repeatedly made fun of him when he met Rosti, and that day. Rosti could no longer contain his irritation. His emotions escalated until he finally killed the victim with a knife in his shop. Ramli died covered in blood, with stab wounds to the stomach, chest, and hands. Indy examines Ramli's body in the morgue. and behind him was standing a spirit with deformed hands and feet. Immediately turned around. Enter another dimension. After finishing off Ramli, Rosti ran in fear into the forest. He felt fear, regret, and hurt very hard. His feelings were so raging. Slowly, Rosti looked up at a tall tree, and he hanged himself, and Indy returned to the real-world dimension again. This evening, Indy walked alone, enjoying the quiet and serene atmosphere of the night. Indy looked around, the usual sight that normal people see. Then Indy slowly stopped in her tracks and looked back. Enter another dimension. Tens or even hundreds of ghosts are busy with activities invisible to the eye, with various shapes and forms. Indy just glanced and turned right and left, occasionally turning around and greeting them. Then suddenly a girl ran into Indy. Indy returns to the human dimension. The girl ran back and forth as if frightened. Indy turned to see the girl running, and then her image disappeared into the darkness of the night. Tonight is Friday night. As usual, Ika's activities are only at home. I'm lying down while scrolling on my cell phone. The clock kept turning and it was already 11 o'clock at night. Suddenly there was a knocking sound from the front door. Ika casually walked towards the front door to open it. He thought it must be his father who had come home. Ika opened the door, and indeed it was her father, even though his father's words sounded strange. Ika just ignored it and wanted to continue her activities. His father came into the room and Ika continued scrolling on his cell phone in the living room. A few minutes later, His father came out again and approached Ika in the living room and sat in the chair next to Ika. Occasionally, Ika glanced slowly at her father, who was just silent without expression. Ika started to feel uneasy. His father's behavior was not normal. Hearing his father's answer, instantly, Ika's heart started beating very fast. Even though today, the mother is staying at her aunt's house because she is helping with her cousin's wedding today, and his father himself was the one who took him this afternoon. Instantly, Ika fell silent in shock. Suddenly, the figure giggled while glancing at Ika. The sound of his laughter became more scary and louder. Without thinking, Ika immediately screamed hysterically and ran out of the house to her neighbor's house. Ika was so scared that she hit someone on the road while running away. Ika went to her neighbor's house. And he told his neighbors about the scary incident. And luckily the neighbor allowed Ika to sleep there until tomorrow, just around 3 in the morning. The father went to the neighbor's house to pick up the fish, but Ika didn't want to go home until the sun rose. To ensure that the father currently standing in front of him was truly human.